consultation that they believed that after careful consideration, and I want to read this, the department determined, DOJ determined, that prior opinions concerning the Constitution's prohibition on federal indictment and prosecution of a sitting president apply to this situation, given that Trump is president-elect. They said that the department believed that this case must be dismissed prior to the inauguration. Now, it's important to point out here that the special counsel is not saying that they don't believe that Trump committed these alleged offenses. In fact, they go out of their way to state that in the 6-page filing. They say, the special counsel does, that prohibition, so the prohibition not to charge a sitting president or a president-elect, that prohibition is categorical and does not turn on the gravity of the crimes charged, the strength of the government's proof, or the merits of the prosecution, which the government stands fully behind. But the reality of this is they're asking the judge in this motion to dismiss to toss out the case. They're saying that they still believe the gravity of these charges. The question is, in terms of what's next, what do we see from the special counsel? We know that under special counsel regulations, the special counsel issues a report when their case is closed. So how soon can we see that report? Is it drafted? It has to go through a classification review. That could take weeks. So are they up against the clock here, and do they release something publicly in report form before the inauguration?
And let's bring in Chief Justice Correspondent Pierre Thomas, because, Pierre, DOJ guidelines mandate that you can't prosecute a sitting president. But could they bring this case back after Trump leaves office?
Well, the statute of limitations will run out in connection with this case, and it's extremely unlikely that that will happen. But, Diane, I think we should put this in perspective. These were two or perhaps the most important cases in DOJ history. They prosecuted a candidate, a former president that they knew was likely going to be the Republican nominee. He was such. Former President Trump bet on himself and that he would win the election. And in doing so, the fact that the DOJ guidelines expressly state you cannot prosecute a sitting president meant that this case was effectively going to end. Today we're getting the specifics as to how. The case now will now be quietly winding down. We'll have to wait and see in terms of when will the special counsel office officially shut down, because here's the thing. The January 6th case has been concluded based on this, if the judge accepts it. We expect later today he will move to remove President Trump from the classified documents case, which is being appealed after it had been dismissed by a federal judge in Florida. So there would be some work that would continue. So the question is, who in the special counsel's office would continue to do that work? Would they simply shut down and allow DOJ to move forward with the appeal? But again, for all intents and purposes, two of the most consequential cases in the history of the Justice Department are being wrapped up.
And I want to go to ABC's Chief Washington correspondent, Jonathan Karl, because, John, the move to drop these cases isn't unexpected, but it is still significant, especially given the amount of work that went into these indictments.
And the scope of this investigation. This is an investigation. Jack Smith was appointed special counsel almost exactly 2 years ago. And over the course of the January 6th investigation, he went to the Supreme Court to fight to get access to key witnesses, including the vice president, the former vice president of the United States, Mike Pence, who was interviewed for this case. So was Donald Trump's former chief of staff, Mark Meadows. So were top aides on his campaign and in his White House. This is an investigation where some $35 million between this and the classified documents case were spent. And it's not even just the special counsel investigation. When you consider that this investigation was preceded by a lengthy investigation in Congress, the January 6th committee, which spent over a year on this and held more than 10 televised hearings, interviewed hundreds of witnesses under oath, including almost all of the president's closest political aides, both in the White House and at his campaign, and established a very thorough record making the case that Donald Trump attempted to use the power of the presidency to overturn a duly certified presidential election, that he tried to undermine the core of American democracy. Now, this is all done. So you might say, Diane, that this case, the January 6th case, never got before a jury. And I'm sure there'll be questions that'll be asked about whether or not this case should have started earlier, so it didn't come up right up against a presidential election. But it never got before a jury. But you could argue that it got before something much larger than a typical jury. 150 million Americans who voted on November 5th and elected Donald Trump president of the United States. That has effectively ended all of this. He ultimately will not be held to account in the criminal court system for his actions to overturn the presidential election of 2020.
And senior investigative correspondent Aaron Katersky, Trump was also facing a number of state and local level cases. So where do those stand now?
Two of them, one down in Georgia, which has been tied up sort of indefinitely in the courts. It appears to be going nowhere fast. That case certainly would have been strengthened, Diane, had Trump been convicted of the federal case that is now going away. So the only trial conviction of the president-elect is the one here in New York. And his attorneys are trying to get that conviction for 34 felony counts of falsifying business records thrown out. They're arguing that a president-elect should be treated just like a sitting president and be able to enter office free of any criminal conviction. And there's a line in the opinion from Jack Smith where he says the constitutional interests of a president and his unfettered performance of his duties must take precedence over the immediate enforcement of the criminal law against a sitting president. I would bet that Trump's attorneys are going to use that to make their final arguments due next month to try and convince a judge here in New York to drop Trump's criminal conviction, even though the Manhattan District Attorney's Office is going to fight that and say they're willing to put it on hold and sentence Trump in 2029 after he leaves office. But it's well possible, Diane, that Trump will enter office with only one case hanging over his head, and that's a civil fraud judgment of about $500 million. Diane?
And I want to bring in our chief legal analyst, Dan Abrams, because, Dan, Jack Smith has tried to distance himself from politics throughout these cases, saying he didn't want the political to impact the legal. So what do you make of these cases seemingly coming to an end in this way? Could it impact any other January 6 cases or any other co-defendants in any of these other cases?
So this is Jack Smith making a practical assessment, right? We've now left the realm of legal, meaning, yes, there are these DOJ guidelines, et cetera, but he's for so long tried to distance himself, separate, put up a wall between the politics and the legal. And now you can't have that wall anymore. And this is the result. But, you know, there's another important point which Jonathan touched on, which is about the timing here. The Trump team as a legal matter has had an enormous success in delaying these cases, meaning that there were a lot of times when, if they hadn't succeeded, these cases could have moved forward. These cases could have been tried. They potentially could have been resolved. But the Trump team successfully delayed the cases to get to this point where here we are at the precipice of the inauguration. The second point on that is that at the outset, the DOJ didn't bring the charges right in 2021. It seemed there was reluctance on the part of the Attorney General to bring any criminal prosecution of Donald Trump until the documents case happened, until that point when he appointed Jack Smith. And Jack Smith effectively started making the decisions. So there are two significant timing issues to think about there, the successes of Trump's delays and the questions that will be asked about the DOJ about when they started these cases at the beginning.
And Catherine, I see the Trump team's already reacting here, calling this a major victory for the rule of law.
They are in a statement from Trump's spokesperson, the incoming White House communications director, Stephen Chung, says the American people reelected President Trump with an overwhelming mandate. Chung says today's decision by DOJ ends the unconstitutional federal cases against President Trump and is a major victory for the rule of law. That is a statement coming in from Trump's incoming communications director, Stephen Chung. I do think it's worth pointing out, though, as we've been discussing, that Jack Smith and DOJ are not saying that they believe that Trump, essentially that they don't believe the charges here, that they don't believe those 4 conspiracy and obstruction counts, and that they're not saying they don't have that evidence. They're saying that because of their assessment internally, and only because Trump is the president-elect and won the election, that is the reasoning for this. They stand by the information, evidence, and their charges, of course, in this indictment and in the classified documents one. I think that this is not the last we'll hear from the Trump people about it, or President-elect Trump himself, and also particularly from now until the inauguration. Do we see a report? Could we see more evidence come to light that we haven't previously seen? All of those things are still on the table.
They sure are. All right, Catherine, Dan, John, Pierre, Aaron, thank you all. And our coverage continues on ABC News Live and abcnews.com. And David will have the latest on World News Tonight. I'm Diane Macedo in New York. Have a great day.
This has been a special report from ABC News.
Diane, thank you so much. I'm Kira Phillips. I'm going to pick things up from here. Special Counsel Jack Smith officially moving to drop the January 6th election interference case against President-elect Trump. He's also expected to move to dismiss the classified documents case against Trump as well, possibly as early as today. As you may remember, Smith charged Trump last year with plotting to overturn the 2020 election and illegally storing those classified documents at his Mar-a-Lago estate. The Department of Justice has had a long-standing policy of not going after sitting presidents, and now it looks like that policy will be enforced when it comes to President-elect Trump and these consequential cases against him. Let's begin with senior reporter Catherine Faulders. I understand we are hearing now from the Trump world. What are they saying?
We are, in a statement from Stephen Chung, the incoming White House communications director, is saying that this is an overwhelming mandate to MAGA, this decision. Chung is saying today's decision by DOJ ends the unconstitutional federal cases against President Trump and is a major victory for the rule of law. That is the statement from the Trump incoming communications director. Kira, it's worth pointing out that Jack Smith lays out how they came to this conclusion to ask the judge to dismiss this case. We know that it's longstanding DOJ a policy that sitting presidents aren't prosecuted. Now, Trump won the election. He currently is president-elect. They lay out here that they went to the Department of Justice Office of Legal Counsel for an opinion on what to do in this time period between Trump winning the election and the inauguration. And they say that the determination by the Office of Legal Counsel was that this case must be dismissed before Trump is inaugurated at the end of January. Now, what's important here is that they specifically say that them asking for this case to be dismissed doesn't mean that they don't essentially believe the gravity of the charges here. Remember, Trump was facing 4 counts of obstruction and conspiracy, of course, in a revised indictment after the Supreme Court essentially said that he was immune from official acts. They took those out. They issued a superseding indictment in August. They write specifically in this filing, and it's important that the prohibition, of course, being that you don't charge a president-elect or a sitting president, that prohibition is categorical and does not turn on the gravity of the crimes charged, the strength of the government's proof, or the merits of the prosecution, which the government stands fully behind. So while the Trump team will attempt to spin this in this statement and in any future statements that they make as a victory for the rule of law and a victory for them, we should obviously remind our viewers that this isn't the government saying they don't stand by their case. They're saying they fully stand behind the evidence that they have. They fully stand behind the case. But because Trump won the election, this can't move forward.
Let's take it now to our chief Washington correspondent, John Karl. It looks like Trump is going to beat all 4 cases, John, against him. That's what it's looking like. So what does that say about our legal system? What does that say about President-elect Donald Trump as a political figure? How does this define moments like January 6th and how we're going to remember it?
Well, this 6-page document really spells it out that there are 2 principles at stake here. One, which Catherine has just alluded to, is that the longstanding policy that you don't indict or prosecute a sitting president because, this is principle number 1, the President of the United States has extraordinarily important duties and must not be unduly encumbered from carrying out those duties on behalf of the country. That's principle 1, hence no prosecution of a sitting president. That is in conflict with another principle that is outlined in this document, and that is that no one, it says no man, citing an earlier opinion, no man is above the law in the United States. those two were in conflict. And the reality is, given that longstanding policy that a president must not be unduly encumbered, there is somebody who is above the law, and that's a president of the United States, in this case, a president-elect. And it is extraordinary that you have had all of these cases that have gone forward. The special counsel case on January 6th is just one of the four. We expect to hear the next step. I'm sure it's going to be just like this one on the classified documents case, which is the other special counsel case. All told, the special counsel had been investigating this, Kira, for a little over 2 years. He was appointed on November 18th of 2022, almost exactly 2 years ago. An investigation that was sprawling, that included fights over getting access to documents and access to witnesses. You remember the special counsel had to fight hard to have the right to interrogate the vice president, the then vice president of the United States, Mike Pence. They effectively won that case, battled all the way to the Supreme Court. The investigation didn't really just begin with the special counsel. I mean, this was really on the shoulders of the January 6th investigation in Congress, which preceded it. A January 6th investigation which was also sprawling. I believe it was more than 1,000 witnesses that were interviewed for the January 6th committee's investigation under oath, more than 10 televised hearings. Almost everybody that worked with Trump on his efforts to overturn the 2020 election from inside the White House, at his campaign, in the states, interviewed for that case. And here it ends, and it's all over. And critics of the former and future president will say he got away with it. He got away with it. Others will say, look, he actually went to a much bigger jury, the jury of the American people. More than 150 million Americans voted, fully aware, with access to information about all of these cases. The only one in New York, it's the only one went to trial, but these indictments were thorough and outlined the case and the evidence compiled against Donald Trump in the January 6th case. It got extensive coverage. As I said, those January 6th committee hearings were televised. And ultimately, Donald Trump won. He won the election. So that jury, that massive jury of 150+ million voters, ultimately voted effectively to, if not exonerate him, to free him from the possibility that he would be prosecuted for what he did after that election in 2020.
And let's not forget the millions and millions of dollars spent on the investigations into President-elect Donald Trump before winning the election for a second term. Let's bring in our Chief Justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas. He's on the phone. So, Pierre, do you think in any way, shape, or form we could eventually see any of those details within the special counsel report?
Well, the special counsel is by DOJ guidance to issue a report. The question now is whether that report can be issued by the time Trump is inaugurated as president. And remember, soon thereafter, you're going to, in theory, have a new sitting attorney general, which will have a lot to say about whether the report is released if it hadn't been released by that particular period of time. Also, that attorney general will have the latitude to review how these cases were conducted. The person may order, some sort of internal inspector general investigation. There are a lot of things that now come into play. But to take a step back, as someone who's covered the department, 25 plus years, these were two of the most important cases in the history of the Justice Department. They decided to seek to prosecute a former president who was the leading candidate and then became the nominee of the Republican Party. There were enormous implications that came with that. It was a huge, gamble on the part of the department. They filed the charges against him. They indicted him, and as John Carl pointed out, the case became mute and effectively over the minute that Trump was elected president-elect. Bottom line, DOJ guidelines expressly state you cannot prosecute a sitting president. And they were guided by that fact, and that's what you're seeing unfold in terms of seeking to dismiss the case before the judge in D.C. regarding the January 6th case. And also later today, we expect that the special counsel will file a motion at the appellate level effectively removing Donald Trump from the classified documents case. That case will continue on appeal in regard to a couple of other defendants. But again, the overriding point of view on this is that sitting president cannot be prosecuted, even as they state in this document released today that they believe in the merits of the case and stand by the merits of the case.
Pierre, thank you. Let's head over now to our legal contributor, Brian Buckmeyer. Brian, what do you make of the timing of all this, and how could this impact all the other January 6th cases?
Yeah, so the timing is really predicated on the election. I think as many people before me has already said, both a combination of Trump's defense team having the expertise to delay to the point that they were hoping and they got what they hoped for, that Donald Trump would be the next sitting president of the United States. And because of policies, he would not be prosecuted from a federal standpoint. And even within the Georgia case that is mired in motions that we're not really seeing an end or beginning, so to speak, in terms of a trial for that. As it applies for other January 6th defendants, I guess in some sense they may think and hope that they may be pardoned by the next sitting president, but for them from a legal standpoint, this doesn't really affect them because this isn't a law that dismisses the case. It is a policy that you do not prosecute a very specific person, and that specific person being the president of the United States does not apply to the other defendants. So we may see information about this case in other ways, shape, or form, but just not any charges as it applies to Donald J. Trump.
Catherine, John, Pierre, Brian, thank you all. So the Menendez brothers are upping their fight for freedom after serving nearly 30 years in prison for murdering their parents in 1989. This afternoon,